Thank you, Claudia, for that more than generous introduction, which I'm not sure I deserve. And thank you all for turning out on such a filthy night to, I hope, either share or gain a knowledge of Spanish art. I will talk for about 40 minutes tonight, and I will then open the floor to questions. I've chosen the title of my paper this evening deliberately because it is the first in this collaborative series of 12 seminars that have been organized between ourselves, that is artists, and Durham, in the presence of Claudia, whom I'd again like to thank very much indeed. My topic tonight seemed entirely appropriate to the mission of both organizations. In brief, for those of you who are unaware of the background, a growing Spanish political predominance in Italy after 1503 led to increasing cultural exchange between the two territories through the rest of the 16th century. This development and efflorescence of the transcultural relationship between Italy and Spain in the 16th century reflects on the mission of both our bodies, as mentioned by Claudia earlier, to popularize and disseminate a wider knowledge of Spanish art in the United Kingdom. Specifically, for those of us whose research interests are concerned with these developments in what is fast becoming an emerging field for academic research, happily the months before the onset of Corona offered an unusually rich feast of museum exhibitions that touched on this topic. Regrettably, however, it has been unavoidably possible to consider these at our leisure ever since, and it may be for a while yet too, I fear. An outstanding example of what I'm talking about was the Alonso Berruguete, first sculptor of Renaissance Spain, exhibition, the catalogue of which you see here. Taking a more broad view now, these exhibitions taken in toto also should allow us to reconsider the place of Spain in the art historical canon and the contributions that it has made, which have long remained unfairly obscured, particularly those outside the so-called Golden Age. I'm just going to quote the words of Lord Clarke, who you could see here, when he was interviewed by the New York Times in 1970 about his great series Civilization, which rather sums up the traditional British attitude neatly. According to Clarke, anyway, Spain remained simply Spain and was largely a repressive regime. An overview of these rigid exhibitions should go a long way towards dispelling this anachronistic viewpoint. Spain was never simply Spain, as this map, albeit inaccurate, should demonstrate. And in the 16th century, her cultural life began to benefit from a reciprocal relationship with Italy. Although in terms of chronology, the exhibitions in question somewhat spill over the edges of any firm date envelope. The years under consideration today will be roughly those between the accession of Charles I and V in 1516 and the death of his grandson, Philip III, in 1621. What follows, in what I shall say tonight, will be discussion of those exhibitions and offer some thoughts arising. It is not a list or a critical review, for those of you who might be expecting that. It would be just as well before I begin, however, just to note the exhibitions that I will be referring to in what follows, as some among my audience may be unfamiliar with them and or their subject matter. Also, because my choice here illustrates the sheer diversity of what can be considered under the broader heading of a 16th century transcultural relationship between Spain and Italy. Five exhibitions then, very different subjects, more or less well known, and in very different locations, but all with a bearing on questions surrounding the 16th century cultural dynamic between Italy and Spain. Today then I will be discussing, from the beginning of the century, the Alonso Berruguete exhibition already mentioned. This is an exhibition that was first in Washington from October 2018 and is still ongoing now at the Meadows Museum at Dallas. From the very end of the century, there was Orazio Borgiani, Un genio inquieto nella Roma di Caravaggio, that was at the Palazzo Barberini in Rome from March until November last. Then there was Historia de dos Pintores, which you can see here at the Prado from October 2019 until this time last year. And of course, last but not least, Titian, Love, Desire, Death, an exhibition that opened in March just before the first lockdown, and will still, I hope, be ongoing at the National Gallery when it eventually reopens. On top of all that, there was yet another El Greco monographic exhibition, El Greco, Ambition and Defiance, that was held in Chicago and Paris, also in late 2019, early 2020. Another reason for my concentrating on these 5 exhibitions today is that I was privileged to be able, despite everything, to see 4 out of the 5 in at least one of their iterations. I have nonetheless somehow been able to study the catalogues for all 5, and some of what I say later builds on the remarkable scholarly apparatus that accompanied them. I will turn to the El Greco, Ambition and Defiance first, however. Also, as appropriately enough, one of the artist's works, this recently rediscovered crucifixion, that was painted late in his career, will form the centerpiece of the new Spanish gallery that will be opening at Bishop Auckland near Durham soon, we hope. This remarkable project has already made a considerable contribution to revitalizing the study of Spanish art in the United Kingdom, and we will, I suspect, be hearing more about these developments next week from McCamey, and that's my plug for keeping you tuned in. I will not, however, be discussing this recent exhibition El Greco in detail, however, not only as it was the one exhibition I was unable to see in person, also because the plethora of recent exhibitions the artist has enjoyed, compared to the other figures whom I will be discussing, particularly in relation to the 500th anniversary of his death in 1614. I mention this exhibition first, nonetheless, as the Cretan remains the figure who in so many ways continues to distort our understanding of the cultural relationship. Not only as El Greco as sui generis, as an artist, but also as the transcultural relationship between Italy and Spain went much deeper than just this one figure. Furthermore, the plethora of exhibitions and scholarly studies devoted to El Greco continue to give a false impression of his contemporary significance in the artistic panorama of 16th century Spain. Can everyone make sure their mute buttons are on, please? Let me just go back. Furthermore, the plethora of exhibitions and scholarly studies devoted to El Greco continue to give a false impression of his contemporary significance in the artistic panorama of 16th century Spain. There are a number of reasons for this superabundance, including a striking appeal for 20th century artists. This was also made clear very recently, just at the National Gallery's Young Bomberg and the Old Masters. This is the comparative exhibition made between the Agony in the Garden of Gethsemane by El Greco's studio and the National Gallery's collection where El Greco studied it, where Bomberg studied it, and Bomberg sat was at work. Nonetheless, El Greco should still be seen as significant for our argument this evening. Recent research has convincingly demonstrated that, in the words of Andrew Casper, the Cretan was, in fact, an artist steeped in the ideas and practices of his time, sharing many of the professional and artistic concerns of the leading artists of Italy. El Greco had traveled from his native Crete via Venice and Rome before eventually ending up in Toledo, but his Italian experience of some 10 years had been formative for his art as much as his Cretan heritage, especially the encounter with a figure who will constantly recur in what follows, Michelangelo. Paintings such as this Pieta or Lamentation from Philadelphia that were included in the exhibition demonstrated the impact of the Florentine on El Greco's brief Roman years through works such as the so-called Bandini Pieta that was originally intended for Michelangelo's own tomb. At Rome, too, El Greco was at the center of cultural life, associated with the Farnese court, and would have enjoyed privileged access. And that, too, was the theme at base that linked all these exhibitions, the travels of artists and works of art between Italy and Spain in the 16th century. El Greco was by no means alone in his travels. And one of the 6 artists included in these 5 exhibitions was born in Spain. but all of the Italians, apart from Titian, had spent a significant amount of time there in the course of their careers. Titian, however, was so famous already by the time of his Spanish period that by then he had no need to travel there himself. The Venetian art writer Carlo Rodolfi, writing in 1648, records that when Charles V sat to Titian in his studio in the 1530s, the artist dropped his paintbrush, which the emperor was only too happy to pick up for him, saying, "Titian is worthy to be served by Caesar." Apocryphal as it probably is, this story became immensely popular among 19th century romantic artists throughout Europe, like the Frenchman Pierre Nolasque Bergeret, seen here, which was painted in 1808. Before I go into detail before any of these exhibitions, let me just first say, however, that in focusing on these particular exhibitions, I could be in danger of propounding a further cliche myself. The assumption has often been that by the 16th century, Spain continued to need to import works, artists and works of art, as she was incapable of producing them for herself. Besides Berruguete, 2 exhibitions at the Uffizi within the last 10 years, discussing the travels of Spanish artists in 16th century Italy, and in particular Norma and Capriccio, seen here, held in 2013, have done much to correct that viewpoint. The choice of works included demonstrated convincingly not only how Spanish artists themselves, such as Berruguete, traveled to Italy to learn new skills, but also what they brought with them in return. These conclusions were reinforced 5 years later in the exhibition Spagna Italia and Dialogo. This focused particularly on the rich collection of drawings by the same Spanish artists that are still held in the Uffizi. What became clear here was the influence of both Lauco and Sculptural and of Michelangelo, both of which will keep recurring in what follows. While at the same time, both exhibitions revealed the sheer number of Spanish artists who now traveled and the quality of their work before and after their time in Italy, especially by comparing it directly with that of their Italian contemporaries. 2 other sculptors, for example, Bartolomeo Ordóñez and Diego de Silue, both based on Burgos, but who had documented work in Naples around 1517, whose sculptures included a Norma and Capriccio, entered an exhibition that had begun with Berruguete. This is Ordóñez's beautiful St. Matthew and the Angel from the Church of St. Peter Martyr in Naples, which also reveals the continuing influence of him on Florentine sculpture. Their Italian period being documented is unusual, I should say. One problem that these exhibitions revealed, however, was the continuing comparative lack of information about Spanish artists in Italy compared to those Italians who had moved to Spain. Let us begin then with Alonso Berruguete, first sculptor of Renaissance Spain, which was basically the first Anglophone exhibition and the first since 1961, anywhere devoted entirely to this remarkable painter and sculptor. And more than that, it succeeded triumphantly. This talk is in no way intended as a panegyric, but I should say, in my own opinion, that the exhibition demonstrated first and foremost that Berruguete should be considered one of the 16th century's greatest masters, to quote from the Burlington Review of the Washington iteration of the exhibition. For those among the audience who are unaware of his life and career, just briefly, Alonso Berruguete was the son of the painter Pedro Berruguete from Paredes de Nava, outside Avila. The exhibition didn't make much of this, but Pedro had himself, and I'll be careful what I say as this is arguable, and this is still a controversial subject, traveled to Italy in the 1470s. He could just be the Pietro Spagnolo who was working for the court of Urbino alongside the Fleming Justice of Ghent, of whose workshop he may have formed part. This is the series of 28 famous men from the Ducal Palace, on which Pedro would have worked, as they were restored and replaced for an exhibition in 2015. hell? My apologies, my screen is frozen. Good. Okay, my apologies for that. Born in Spain in the late 1480s, inspired by his father or not, Alonso moved to Florence around 1506, where he remained for roughly 10 years. His career leads to the first of my reflections this evening, which is just how easily Spanish artists were able to travel to and from Italy by the 16th century, and the reasons for their doing so. Maybe not by 1516, but certainly by 1555, when Charles V resigned his throne, the Mediterranean had become almost a Spanish lake, in which the circulation of people and objects was now a commonplace event. Nonetheless, even in Alonso's lifetime, the intervention of a powerful patron was often necessary to accomplish such a move, and the exhibition speculates as to who that might have been in his case, settling on relations established in the clerical hierarchy. The first room in this small display in Washington, seen here, which had only 2 rooms in total, shows Berruguete learning avidly while in Florence, and how much he took from his own experiences in Italy back to Spain with him. Nonetheless, his Italian period was short, 10 years give or take, compared to the almost 45 years of active work that awaited him on his return to Spain. It was a problem here, however, and with several of the exhibitions that will be discussed, that they were on a small scale, so were unable to illustrate the full range of potential material. Also, with Berruguete in particular, the sheer size and lack of portability of his later works in Spain was a hindrance. A triumph for the exhibition, however, was the reconstruction of at least a part of the vast Benito retablo, the high altar of the royal monastery of the same name in Valladolid. Unfortunately, the one thing you can't do with these is a pointer, but I hope you can see where the part of the retablo that was in the exhibition came from. This is arguably Berruguete's masterpiece, on which he worked between 1526 and 1533, but it was regrettably disassembled in the 19th century, although it survives largely intact. This had 5 rows of sculpture, and when intact was of vast size. Of course, Berruguete didn't sculpt or gild all of it himself. It would have been an impossible undertaking, but was now the head of a large workshop. He was therefore responsible for the overall design and of taking creative control by using drawings and models as interpretive tools for others. William Wallace has described the same process when used by Michelangelo as multiple authorship, especially through this medium of drawings, in which Berruguete was unusually prolific among his Spanish contemporaries. And from this first room, the audience was able to comprehend his learning process in Florence that had led up to this achievement. And again, coming back to a theme today, while in Florence, Berruguete had learned from the sculptors Donatello and Michelangelo in particular. With Michelangelo, indeed, he was on warm personal terms, and was described by Michelangelo in favorable terms in a letter to his brother of July 1508, in which he allowed Berruguete to look at the incomplete Sistine ceiling, which was in itself a rare privilege. Berruguete learnt not only drawing, however, as the exhibition demonstrated, but also modeling in Florence. He must have quickly made an established position for himself, as he took part in the famous competition that is described by Vasari, that is taking place at some time between 1506 and 1508. This was for 4 artists, chosen by the architect Bramante, to make a wax model of the Laocoon. And the Laocoon, if you don't know, was the famous Roman sculptural group that had only been discovered in 1506 at a vineyard in Rome, but was immediately famous. Just the sacrifice of Isaac from the San Benito retablo shows how much Berruguete took inspiration from that. And this was the same sculpture that was later to influence El Greco in Rome, and whose example was to remain influential through his Spanish career. Indeed, The last exhibition dedicated to Berrughetti's Italian experiences and his contact with classical antiquity, it was held in Valladolid in 2017, was simply called sorry, my pronunciation is gone, was simply called in English The Son of Laocoon. Unfortunately, however, this time here, when there were no comparative works by Berrughetti's Italian contemporaries included in the exhibition, there were also only a couple of his own paintings included, of which he may have produced a number one in Florence, although no attribution is certain. The style and format of these clearly illustrate the local influence, such as the tondo format of this Madonna and Child with the young St. John from Palazzo Vecchio. Like Michelangelo, Berrughetti was also able to move seamlessly between painting and sculpture. And it's just worth noting here too, how Spanish craftsmen were able to move media as they traveled. There may be only the one a sculpture attributed to Berrughetti from Florence, this Madonna della Cintola from the Church of Santo Spirito. But on his return to Spain, he worked almost exclusively as a sculptor in a variety of media, as the second room of the Washington exhibition made very clear. Furthermore, he almost immediately upon his return to Spain in 1518 became Pintor del Rey, his Italian experiences privileging his seamless reintegration as a respected court artist, a role which he retained for the rest of his career. Any discussion of Berrughetti leads me naturally to Orazio Borgiani on Genio Inquieto, which was the first exhibition ever dedicated solely to this particular artist. Although again it was small, particularly regarding the amount of his own work that was included, Borgiani, who was born in Rome in 1474 and died there in 1616, is not perhaps a first ranker like Berrughetti, but he came across as a highly competent artist nonetheless. From the evidence of this exhibition, his art stands up to well to that of his better known contemporaries, the principal comparator chosen for the exhibition being Caravaggio, about whom we know far too much these days. At first glance, the exhibitions may seem very different, sculptor versus painter, Spaniard versus Italian, so why am I pairing them here? Berrughetti had a 10-year stint learning as a young artist in Florence, while Borgiani's career from the end of the century now demonstrates just how easily an artist can move back and forth across the Tyrrhenian Sea at all stages of his career and assume a professional position in both polities. Although Borgiani's extensive Spanish travels are attested by the art writer and artist Giovanni Baglioni, even the new research for the exhibition, however, has not been able to clarify how long exactly Borgiani spent in Spain and how often. Did he go once? Was he there more than once? How long for? We still don't know. What is certain is that he was not a static presence there and is recorded as having visited a number of the principal cities. Furthermore, on the 22nd of June, 1603, he became one of the founding members of the Madrid Academy. The question is unanswerable in part because the exhibition was tantalizingly incomplete. As so often in Italian exhibitions, the material was confined to that solely available in Italy, with an exception I shall note. No attempts appears to have made to obtain loan works from Spanish collections. Indeed, the subtitle of the exhibition, Nella Roma di Caravaggio, and the emphasis on his pupils and successors in Rome, comprising almost half the works displayed, in fact obscured perhaps the more interesting half of Borgiani's career, to me at least, and to this audience. Regrettably so, as a number of his major commissions end up in Spain, and without them, any picture of his career remains incomplete. And I've just been using as an illustration throughout this, his dramatic martyrdom of St. Lawrence from the collegiate church at Roncesvalles, to which I shall return. While the cycle of 9 paintings that Borgiani was commissioned for the convent of Porticelli and Valladolid, including this Assumption, were probably the commission that most cemented his status among Spanish clients. These, which are now almost entirely inaccessible, were commissioned by the powerful statesman and founder of the convent, Rodrigo Calderon, the minister of Philip III before his fall, through the intervention of the ambassador at Rome, Francisco de Castro. Here's one for Claudia. Also interesting in a Spanish context is the striking St. Christopher, painted on a large scale, which illustrates by talk. The Roman exhibition included the version from Edinburgh, which I'm showing here, but also published for the first time a newly discovered version of this composition that was sold at Christie's last summer, or for sale at least. There are several other versions besides surviving, notably in Spain, and as we shall see, the St. Christopher appeared in different forms too. The success of the St. Christopher then proves how certain compositions by Italian artists gained particular popularity among Spanish patrons, and could therefore be repeated several times both by themselves and by other artists. This is a phenomenon that can already be seen developing in the career of the Venetian artist based in Rome, Sebastiano del Piombo, in the first half of the century. On the other hand, much more than in Sebastiano's time, Rome, seen here in the from the room of the maps in the Vatican in the mid-1570s, was now a Spanish city. A papal aviso of 1582 estimated that Spaniards made up some 30% of Rome's population by the end of the century, which may not be an exaggeration. Even when Borgiani was back in residence in Rome, the larger portion of his patients remained Spaniards, who were resident there themselves, occupying a wide variety of roles. The historian Thomas Dandley has gone so far then to refer to Rome at the end of the 16th century as a Spanish Avignon. Borgiani was able to associate with Spanish artists there too, such as the Toledan Louis Tristan, whom he would have already met during his own time in the ecclesiastical capital of Spain, Toledo. Although again, Tristan's exact dates in Rome are uncertain. And bringing our story full circle, Tristan was of course probably the best known pupil of El Greco. And all this finally leads on to another thought, another unanswerable question, as to how the Spanish dimension to his artistic networks and to his patronage affected the development of Borgiani's style. To quote a different Burlington review, the extent to which Borgiani was a Spanish as much as an Italian painter. This is a hypothesis that is only tentatively advanced in the catalogue of the exhibition, but it is entirely plausible. And again, it is a question that I've already explored elsewhere for the career of Sebastiano del Piombo. All these issues for Borgiani are summed up in this astonishing and rarely seen altarpiece, San Carlo Borromeo visiting the plague-stricken, where the recently canonized San Carlo Borromeo is visiting the plague-stricken in Milan in 1576, which greeted visitors at the entrance to the exhibition. Unfortunately, this illustration, although it is quite good, doesn't give you an idea of the dramatic scale of this painting. It was originally in the Roman headquarters of the Spanish Mercedarian order, the Church of San Adriano in Foro, which will be known to most of you as it is the Senate building, and was commissioned by the Spanish ambassador already mentioned, Francisco de Castro, to Borgiani around 1612-1613 for his own chapel there. Borgiani was also, however, equally closely tied to the erudite Spanish collector and secretary to the ambassador, Juan de Lezcano, who owned no less than 12 of his works, which are now dispersed or lost. It is possible to trace some works, arguably, such as this Roncesvalles painting, back to Lezcano's collection. Finally, the exhibition also touched on the role of prints and the role they played for Roman artists in marketing themselves to a Spanish clientele, showing the version of St. Christopher that Borgiani dedicated to Lezcano in 1615, just before his death. As an aside, and looking ahead hopefully to a better future, there is an exhibition that was supposed to be on view now, but has unfortunately been postponed for obvious reasons, and should be hopefully in Barcelona, Madrid, and Rome, and which will allow us to reflect further on that Spanish preponderance in Rome at the turn of the 17th century, and that is Carracci, La Capella Herrera. This image shows the pieces of the chapel as they're currently installed in the Manac in Barcelona, alongside the altarpiece showing Herrera's son Diego being dedicated to Christ, which has remained in the Spanish church in Rome, Santa Maria di Monserrato. In toto, The ensemble is a remarkably surviving example of Spanish self-promotion at the heart of the Catholic world. The wealthiest banker in Rome and also papal treasurer, the Spaniard Juan Enriquez de Herrera, commissioned the most advanced artist in Rome, Annibale Carracci, to decorate his family chapel as an ex voto for his son Diego. This chapel was dedicated to the recently canonized Spanish saint Diego de Alcala and was the first on the right in the Spanish National Church, San Giacomo degli Spagnoli. This church fronted onto the major urban center of Piazza Navona, which became therefore the preferred site for Spanish ceremonial at Rome, which I won't go into today. Unfortunately, the chapel dismantled in the 1830s, split between various institutions, and has not been seen in toto since. If the exhibition happens, it will represent another unique opportunity. Borgiani, though, also leads us on to the Prado exhibition, Historia de dos Pintores, and to questions of identities at this period. I've been talking so far indiscriminately about Italy and Spain, but for this year's that may be erecting a false dichotomy. This exhibition concentrated on the careers of two pioneering female artists of the 16th century, Lavinia Fontana and Sophonisba Arangusola, neither of whom had ever enjoyed a monographic exhibition before. One of these two, Sophonisba Arangusola, was born in Cremona, then a Spanish territory as part of the Viceroyalty of Milan, into an impoverished nobility, and went even further in her travels than Borgiani. Her father had promoted her artistic talent, first at Rome, where, returning to the theme throughout today's paper, she found favor with the aged Michelangelo. She then moved to Spain between 1559 and 1571, where she joined the royal court, not only as lady-in-waiting to Queen Elizabeth of Valois, but also to teach her painting. At the Spanish court, Sophonisba became one of the very few female court portraitists and painted portraits of the royal family from the king downwards. These adapted fully to the norms of that court, and particularly to those of the official portraitist Alonso Berruguete. Here are two portraits of King Philip from 1573 by both artists to show the evident similarities. That is just before Sophonisba left the court. After the death of his first queen, Philip II had arranged for Sophonisba's marriage to a Sicilian nobleman in the early 1570s. Sophonisba continues to be discussed rightly as a pioneering female artist, but it's perhaps equally interesting that she was able to live out her artistic life within an almost exclusively Spanish sphere. So to conclude, what about Titian then? He scarcely needs any introduction here, and like El Greco has been the subject of innumerable recent exhibitions. What is maybe less well known to some members of this audience is that from the time of the coronation of the Emperor Charles V at Bologna in 1530, Titian had become the favored artist of the Spanish, or perhaps a better word, imperial elite. The seven poesie are the culmination of that strand of his career. And to have all the paintings of the series reunited at the National Gallery this last year has been a once-in-a-lifetime experience. It also allows for broader reflections on their creation, as in this case, it was not the artist who traveled, but the objects he created. Furthermore, almost all of Philip's other commissions from Titian were for religious paintings. This offer of a sweeping classical canvas at the artist's discretion was a virtual unicum. Here, the world's most powerful monarch was giving free rein to perhaps the most famous artist alive, and the results more than justified that. The Danae was delivered in 1553, and the series concluded with the rape of Europa in the early 1560s. A remarkable accomplishment for an artist who was then in his mid-80s. As with the El Greco, however, I'd rather not say too much here, as Titian and the poesie have been much studied, but they are a fitting point to conclude, as they remain the enduring monument to the symbiotic Italian-Spanish cultural dynamic in the 16th century. I've confined myself here this evening to discussing only those artists and works of art who have been included in recent exhibitions, and thoughts arising from those exhibitions. I've obviously left out a whole lot more bearing on the development in the 16th century. That is both in terms of the works of art themselves and of the relevant literature. Maybe the best way for me to conclude then, rather than a summing up of what I've said already, would be to consider if the world of exhibitions is able to return as it was, who else bestriding the cultural landscape between Spain and Italy in the 16th century deserves a reassessment? Let me finish then with just the obvious figure, that of the Andalusian Gaspar Becerra, whose remarkable retablo for a Astorga cathedral I'm showing here. That'd be a difficult exhibition to conceptualize, as so much has been destroyed or is immovable. But Becerra was first an artist at the cutting edge during the 15 years he spent in Rome, between the early 1450s and 1557, before immediately returning to the most prestigious sculptural commissions in Spain. Becerra died, unfortunately, relatively young, before his Spanish career fully developed. And I think that's an appropriate point for me to finish before you all lose the will to live. Let me hand back to Claudia.